You've seen fentanyl in headlines, but here's the part that gets ignored. A large share of the people dying in 2025 weren't even trying to use it. They thought they were taking cocaine, Xanax, or even Adderall. Fentanyl shows up everywhere because dealers cut it into counterfeit pills and stimulants. Tiny amounts imitate stronger drugs and stretch supply. Users end up playing biochemical roulette without knowing it. In this video, we'll break down why fentanyl tricks the brain so completely, how the economics behind it keep driving its spread, and why time and tools like Naloxone matter for survival. And when you look at the numbers behind this crisis today, the scale is hard to ignore. The new wave of the crisis. What has changed most sharply in recent years is not just the rising count of overdoses, but the way the crisis itself has shifted shape. This is the new wave of the epidemic, one where fentanyl no longer sits at the margins but has taken over the center. Today, the majority of opioid-involved overdose deaths are driven by illicitly manufactured synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Just a decade ago, heroin accounted for the bulk of fatal cases, along with prescription opioids such as oxycodone and hydrocodone. That balance has collapsed. Now fentanyl and its analogs dominate, cutting across every dataset, public health bulletin, and courtroom report. What was once a problem tied to specific drugs or regions has become a broad-spectrum threat, powered by a single synthetic compound that can end life with the most minuscule amount. What makes this phase especially disturbing is that the people dying often never intended to take fentanyl at all. A student assumes they're buying cocaine for a night out, a young worker thinks they got an anti-anxiety pill, or a festival goer believes a tablet is ecstasy. Each of these examples ends the same way: the drug isn't what it appears to be. The substitution is invisible, and the dose is unpredictable. This blurring of boundaries has severed the old logic that avoiding opioids meant safety. Fentanyl has redrawn every line by showing up in substances that once carried a far lower perceived risk. The shift has struck hard because it puts ordinary experimentation on a collision course with a compound strong enough to cause respiratory failure in seconds. Public health maps that once traced opioid misuse to a handful of concentrated regions no longer look the same. Instead of being confined to rural pill mill corridors or urban heroin markets, the tragedy now reaches into suburbs, campuses, and casual community spaces. Fentanyl spread through drug supplies so quickly that every demographic came to face the same vulnerability. A disturbingly large share of fatal overdoses today involve people with little or no opioid history. Some were experimenting for the first time or simply taking what they believed to be a legitimate pill from a friend. What makes fentanyl uniquely threatening is that it offers no runway. Its potency bypasses the gradual escalation more familiar with older opioids. There's often no tolerance built, no adjustment period, just a sudden collapse of breathing, unless someone nearby acts with naloxone almost instantly. Too often, that chain of events never happens in time. What makes the deception seamless is how authentic the counterfeits look. A fentanyl-laced pill can carry the same imprint as a pharmaceutical tablet. A powder may resemble cocaine with no visible clue. Even handlers often underestimate what they're distributing because concentrations are uneven. That's why two people can split what looks like the same pill, one walking away unharmed, the other dying within minutes. These hidden substitutions explain why fentanyl keeps appearing on death certificates in cases where the victim never knowingly chose an opioid. Despite visible harm reduction efforts, test strips at concerts, naloxone kits in public venues, the crisis continues to accelerate. The reason isn't simply that fentanyl is strong, it's that it hides in plain sight. Every contaminated line or capsule turns routine decisions into lethal risks. Psychologically, many still believe danger belongs to other users, but the substance keeps dismantling that assumption one case at a time. On the supply side, fentanyl's rise makes brutal sense. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which depend on crops, harvests, and long trafficking routes, fentanyl is a lab product. A kilogram can be diluted into millions of saleable doses, moving through supply chains with far less space and weight. That efficiency brings massive profits while minimizing enforcement exposure. Evidence of this spread is visible in law enforcement seizures. In 2023, officials intercepted more than 115 million fentanyl-laced pills nationwide. Such staggering numbers illustrate how thoroughly fentanyl has worked its way into the retail drug market. At this point, even calling it an opioid crisis risks understating the scope. Fentanyl has gone beyond the heroin landscape of the past to infiltrate cocaine, counterfeit prescription pills, and recreational party drugs. For users, the world of street drugs no longer looks like a field of separate choices. Lines between categories have blurred. Trusting that a powder or pill matches its surface identity has become a gamble stacked against survival. The cultural impact of this new wave is quieter but profound. Family warnings used to highlight issues like drunk driving or traditional hard drugs. Now, those conversations shift. A single pill passed around at a party or a casual experiment with something mislabeled could be fatal. Mental health clinicians recognize that counterfeit anxiety medications circulate as hazards. Law enforcement notes fentanyl appearing in unexpected packaging, even on products meant to imitate harmless edibles. The trickle of accidents reinforces that no one is shielded simply by avoiding opioids in name. Reports also show that people outside stereotypical drug spheres are dying after unintentional exposure. Microgram amounts can be lethal, so a trace on a surface or mixed into a counterfeit tablet alters the outcome dramatically. These hazards reshape perceptions because now casual users, or people who never considered themselves at risk of addiction, have become frequent entries in overdose statistics. The folk knowledge that once guided drug culture, judging batch strength, testing pills informally, trusting certain sources, has been erased. Fentanyl hides too well for anyone to spot with their senses. Doses are inconsistent because mixing is uneven, magnifying unpredictability. The same batch may hold both survivable and deadly amounts. This fuels the central fear of fentanyl. No one, not even those who sell it, fully understands what's inside a given sample. Statisticians describe fentanyl less as a new competitor in the market and more as a contaminant that remakes the definitions entirely. Cocaine seized today often contains opioids. Xanax purchased on the street rarely holds alprazolam alone. Even heroin now tends to arrive blended with fentanyl. Street drugs in 2025 cannot be assumed to be what their labels imply. The compound is saturated enough to function as the default ingredient rather than the exception. The conclusion of this phase is stark. What used to be drug culture segmented into categories, cocaine, pills, heroin, now collapses into one reality. Fentanyl governs them all. Substances picked up at a party, festival, or house gathering can no longer be trusted to be what they are claimed to be. That chemical substitution means fentanyl hasn't just amplified the crisis, it has rewritten what the street drug supply even is, replacing familiar choices with something fundamentally different. But fentanyl's reign isn't just about markets and supply lines. What makes it so uniquely disastrous is how it exploits the very systems inside the human body designed to guide survival. To see why its small amounts collapse breathing so swiftly and why the reward feels so irresistible, we need to look at how the brain itself receives the chemical signal. The brain's lock-in key. Picture the brain as a vast network of doors, each equipped with a unique lock. These locks are known as opioid receptors, and the most important of them for the effects of opioids is the mu-opioid receptor. Your body already makes its own keys for these locks. Those keys are endorphins, small chains of molecules released in precise, occasional bursts. They appear when you laugh, when you finish a run, or when you injure yourself and need to dull sharp pain. Their purpose is not to overwhelm you with euphoria, but to adjust your experience in balanced amounts. Stub your toe and endorphins provide just enough relief to let you keep moving. Push through a difficult workout and they give you that brief sensation people call a runner's high. In short, the system isn't about indulgence, it's about calibration. Too much pain would immobilize us. Too much pleasure and drive would evaporate. Endorphins help right a middle path, with receptors serving as the regulators that keep signals proportionate. Of course, biology is not perfect safeguard design. Receptors don't act like conscious gatekeepers. Under chronic drug exposure, their signaling can change, rewiring whole circuits with consequences that nature never intended. On a microscopic scale, the process is elegant. Mu-opioid receptors sit on neurons that help regulate both reward perception and pain signaling. When inactive, those neurons freely pass on messages of distress, injury, or stress. When receptors bind endorphins, the electrical activity on the neuron shifts, reducing the message's intensity and releasing a sense of relief. What makes the system efficient is that endorphins act only where they are needed. A jab to the elbow quiets only that local pain, rather than numbing the entire body. This is the artistry of a system tuned by evolution. Receptors and endorphins align in a way that produces just enough correction to keep you functioning. We'll simplify the deeper molecular detail, but the central idea is this: the body produces opioids carefully and locally, And the receptors, they act upon moderate survival, critical sensations like pain and reward. This balance is where synthetic opioids create disruption. Fentanyl is not a product of plants like morphine derived from the opium poppy. It is lab-made, designed with a potency that evolution never prepared the brain to handle. Once fentanyl enters the blood and reaches the brain, it doesn't nudge receptors quietly. It overruns them in a concentrated assault. Imagine every lock in the house being forced open simultaneously. To the receptor, there is no difference between the key forged by nature and the chemical key built in a laboratory. The difference is in intensity. Endorphins are whispers. Fentanyl is a shout. The receptor system itself didn't evolve to anticipate synthetic molecules of this design. Its role was to help humans survive environments full of injury, fatigue, and danger. Pain signaled damage. Endorphins offered relief only when necessary to keep you moving. Fentanyl manipulates that system, forcing the receptors to broadcast signals of relief even while real threats remain. It's as though a car's dashboard warning lights were disconnected in the middle of a crash. Relief is announced, but the danger never stopped. The system has been tricked into generating false safety reports, crippling the feedback mechanisms that balance survival. A major reason for vulnerability lies in fentanyl structure. This molecule is small, slippery, and able to bind mu opioid receptors with remarkable strength. It attaches more firmly than morphine, faster than heroin, and produces effects that far exceed what naturally occurring opioids could ever reach. If heroin is like a crowbar prying at a door, fentanyl is closer to a battering ram smashing through the frame. Because of this high affinity, even microgram amounts can hijack the system in seconds. A human could release endorphins for a lifetime and never equal the magnitude of force fentanyl exerts in a single dose. For perspective, the bursts of endorphins from laughter, affection, or exercise measure in nanograms, quantities so small that laboratories need specialized tools to detect them. These brief releases are enough to dull pain or lift mood in fleeting ways. In contrast, a speck of fentanyl visible on a fingertip may contain a concentration capable of activating millions of receptors all at once. That overwhelming binding explains why particles as light as dust can halt breathing. Fentanyl doesn't just unlock the receptor system, it bullies the entire structure until basic signals collapse. The effect is not confined to pain and pleasure in the moment. Opioid receptors are embedded in broader networks that handle memory and learning, including the mesolimbic reward pathway. In this circuit, neurons from the ventral tegmental area project into the nucleus accumbens, teaching the brain which experiences are worth repeating. Normally, a workout might feel rewarding, and your brain encodes that memory to motivate you to run again. An injury teaches avoidance. Fentanyl short-circuits both lessons. It floods the reward system so powerfully that the experience is imprinted as a pinnacle sensation that must be pursued, even though it carries lethal risk. The lock is tampered with, yet the brain records it as a signal to repeat. Another layer of this system explains why dependence is so punishing. Over time, the receptors stop responding normally. With each episode of fentanyl stimulation, the brain adjusts, dampening its own sensitivity to restore balance. This is the biological basis of tolerance. The more locks are battered open, the less intact the structure becomes. Eventually, ordinary endorphins, those tiny surges that once lifted mood or encouraged resilience, barely register at all. The system has recalibrated to expect a constant flood. It takes larger and larger doses to produce the same high, while normal experience starts to feel hollow. The same adaptation also feeds into withdrawal. One key site is the locus ceruleus, a region that releases the neurotransmitter noradrenaline. Under opioids, this region is suppressed. With repeated use, the neurons compensate by increasing their excitability. Remove the drug suddenly, and the locus ceruleus fires without restraint, releasing excess noradrenaline throughout the body. That surge creates the familiar symptoms: agitation, sweating, shaking, nausea, and overwhelming anxiety. This is why opioid withdrawal feels so severe. The same system that was calmed under the drug rebounds with violent intensity once the chemical support is gone. All of this shows why fentanyl is more than just another chemical stimulant. It isn't simply about chasing the euphoric sensation. It is about the disruption of a system that was honed for balance, converting a finely regulated mechanism into one dominated by brute force. Endorphins act like precise instruments, carefully adjusting mood and pain to guide decisions. Fentanyl acts like a blunt weapon, smashing every receptor without subtlety, changing circuit responses and reshaping behavior itself. It's also important to stress how passive the receptors are. They cannot distinguish between natural and synthetic. They don't possess defenses to block an intruder molecule. Whatever fits is accepted. And fentanyl, because of its chemical design, fits almost perfectly, sticking tightly and refusing to let go. This leaves the body in a lopsided struggle. Nature designed locks to respond to fleeting signals, while human engineering created a key that clings and overwhelms. On one side, a delicate biology. On the other, a molecule optimized for binding power. Unlike natural endorphins, which degrade within minutes, fentanyl lingers. While endorphins appear and vanish quickly, restoring balance, fentanyl sustains its activation long enough to keep receptors overstimulated. The body begins to lose grip on basic vital functions, breathing slows, alertness fades, and the perception of comfort continues unnaturally. This persistence is part of why fentanyl is so dangerous. By holding the system wide open, it breaks the rhythm necessary for survival and pushes machinery designed for fluctuations into destructive overdrive. This is the core of how fentanyl manipulates brain function. It may be described as tricking the system, but more accurately, it's brute force impersonation. The receptors evolve to respond with moderation, yet fentanyl hijacks the process until breathing, perception, and decision-making are compromised. Each natural balance point is inverted. Pain no longer teaches caution. Pleasure no longer reflects success. What kept humans oriented toward survival is replaced by imitation signals that do not align with reality. Endorphins create moments of clarity, a release after laughter, a sense of reward after perseverance, or the calm that follows stress. They are evidence of a system that normally works with precision. When fentanyl enters, it targets the very same receptors, but uses them against the body that built them. What should be survival signaling becomes vulnerability. The locks that once ensured balance become weaknesses that computer-engineered molecules can exploit. Understanding this opens another question. If the receptor system itself explains how opioids produce pleasure and dependence, what is it about fentanyl as a specific molecule that makes it so much deadlier than morphine or heroin, the drugs it has replaced? The answer begins with how quickly this compound enters the brain, how strongly it binds once there, and how little of it is required to overpower the body's most critical functions. Why fentanyl hits differently. Why fentanyl stands apart from its opioid relatives comes down to more than potency. It's about the unique way it operates inside the body and brain. Morphine and heroin are already infamous for their ability to relieve pain and create euphoria. Yet fentanyl is positioned differently. Research estimates it can be multiple tens of times more potent than heroin, often cited in the 20-50 times range, which explains why minuscule amounts cause outsized effects. The factor that makes fentanyl lethal is not a better high, but how its chemistry changes nearly every dimension of exposure: entry speed, receptor binding, potency, and risk of sudden shutdown. Morphine serves as the older standard. When injected or swallowed, it circulates in the blood and eventually reaches the brain, producing pain relief and sedation in a gradual wave. Heroin, created from morphine, alters this process by being more fat-soluble. That property helps it cross the blood-brain barrier faster, leading to the notorious immediate rush. The blood-brain barrier itself functions like a checkpoint, limiting chemical access to protect sensitive tissue. Morphine gets through only after delay. Heroin moves faster, but fentanyl bypasses restrictions with even greater efficiency. Its extreme lipid solubility allows it to pass into the brain with almost no resistance. If you picture morphine cautiously walking through security line by line and heroin slipping through with a quicker pass, fentanyl looks like someone with special credentials who skips the process entirely. Within seconds of ingestion or inhalation, fentanyl is already at full receptor activation, leaving almost no gap between use and collapse. This explains why overdoses unfold so abruptly. Heroin sometimes provides a short period of warning, slow movements, heavy eyelids before breathing danger sets in. Fentanyl strips that window almost completely, often shifting someone from alert to unconscious within moments. Once fentanyl arrives inside the brain, its behavior changes the risk even. Further, opioid receptors accommodate natural endorphins with short, subtle interactions. Morphine copies that mechanism but detaches after a time. heroin binds longer. Fentanyl, though, attaches with unusually high affinity. It clings more firmly like glue and activates the receptor with full force. That saturation overwhelms the system because there is no opportunity for signals to taper or retreat. Even a trace amount continues pressing down heavily on receptor networks that control pleasure and pain. Potency magnifies this danger. In medical context, morphine doses are measured in milligrams, small but tangible units still visible to the human eye. Heroin also operates at low milligram doses when injected recreationally. Fentanyl's effective dose, however, measures in micrograms, that is thousands of a milligram. To the naked eye, the usable dose looks closer to dust than powder. This isn't abstract math. It means that the difference between relief and death is measured in amounts smaller than a few grains of table salt. A dosing error for morphine might bring nausea or excessive sedation. A dosing error for fentanyl can mean instant fatality. This narrow threshold is described pharmacologically as a very small therapeutic index, the ratio between a helpful dose and a lethal one. Morphine offers slightly more leeway. Heroin holds some middle ground, at least with experienced users. Fentanyl, by contrast, makes the margin almost non-existent. The body cannot differentiate between a dose meant to relieve pain and one that suppresses breathing until it is too late. This is why unintentional use leads to so many fatalities. When individuals think they are using cocaine, MDMA, or counterfeit pills, there is no buffer for survival estimates or slow realization. Another defining factor is the style of onset. Morphine produces steady sedation. Heroin delivers a sharper but still structured sequence: rush, euphoria, drowsiness. Fentanyl interrupts that pattern almost entirely. It floods receptors, unleashes dopamine in reward circuits, and simultaneously depresses the brainstem structures that govern unconscious breathing. Instead of drifting, consciousness can snap off in minutes. Emergency studies note that hypoxia, the loss of oxygen to the brain, can show measurable effects within 60 seconds of fentanyl's respiratory suppression, harming neural tissue almost immediately. This shortens the window for intervention significantly compared with heroin overdoses. This difference in speed alters how overdoses present to others. With heroin, bystanders might notice signs: slurred speech, gradual nodding, shallow, queasy movement. With fentanyl, the collapse may come with little warning: a sudden fall, bluish coloration of the lips, chest rising unevenly or not at all. The steepness of the dose-response curve leaves almost no intermediary signs between intoxication and life-threatening suppression. It mimics a switch turning off, where companions hardly have time to realize what happened before the person on the ground is already deprived of oxygen. Complicating things is fentanyl's tendency to disperse unevenly when diluted into counterfeit drugs. Because it requires such small storable volume, pressing or mixing it rarely leads to uniform distribution. One pill might contain an unnoticeable fraction of a microgram. The next in the same batch could be loaded well past lethal levels. This inconsistency amplifies risk for casual users who believe a prior sample indicates safety. Each trial spin has radically different odds built in, making survival one attempt and respiratory shutdown the next. From a user's perspective, fentanyl also creates an unpleasant paradox. Many reports suggest the euphoric high is actually briefer and harsher than heroin's. Heroin intoxication can last several hours, maintaining sedation and withdrawal protection. Fentanyl brings an intense but short-lived high, followed quickly by a sharp return to negative symptoms, including craving and withdrawal onset. This provokes rapid redosing behavior, as individuals chase relief not for pleasure, but to stave off discomfort. The cycle drives repeated exposures that compound overdose risk within a short time frame. If morphine and heroin resemble long building waves, fentanyl looks more like a violent collapse. It doesn't integrate into the body's rhythm, but imposes disruption as a sudden shock. This metaphor explains why so few users perceive unfolding danger. The drug saturates within moments, leaves swiftly, but imprints a blunt crash that drives compulsive reuse. Inside tissues, remnants remain, yet the euphoria recedes quickly, fueling repeated dosing patterns that push the line between survival and suffocation ever closer. The potency also complicates medical response. Naloxone remains the standard reversal drug used globally, and it still works against fentanyl by competing for the same receptor sites.
But because fentanyl binds so tightly and
Clears slowly compared to heroin. Reversing overdoses frequently requires multiple administrations. First responders often apply repeated doses until breathing resumes. While naloxone's effectiveness persists, the intervention demands persistence and preparation, especially in non-hospital settings where time and supplies may be limited. The risk is greater not because naloxone fails, but because fentanyl demands stronger, repeated effort to dislodge. What ties these properties together is their combined effect on fundamental survival. Fentanyl enters faster than morphine or heroin, holds receptors with unmatched grip, delivers impact at trace amounts, and cuts off respiratory control before the body can adapt. The resulting danger lies not in producing a stronger euphoria, but in collapsing protective buffers that humans once relied upon to measure, monitor, and respond. Each aspect, entry, binding, potency, distribution, coordinates toward one outcome: abrupt and confusing shutdown of consciousness. This is why fentanyl has changed the terms of opioid use. It didn't replace heroin because it felt more rewarding. It displaced it because its chemistry met distribution efficiency, market incentives, and biological vulnerability in a way no user could manage safely. For those caught in its path, the shift feels less like a new drug arriving, and more like an old game gaining rules too volatile to survive. And yet, the most devastating impact of fentanyl comes not only from how addictive or fleetingly euphoric it is, but from its influence on the body's core automatic processes. At the center of this crisis lies the function most essential and usually invisible: breathing, the respiratory trap. Breathing is controlled by a network so deeply wired into the brainstem that most people never think about it. The rhythm that brings air in and out is set automatically, handled by clusters of neurons at the base of the brain. These respiratory centers adjust constantly. They speed up during exertion, slow down during sleep, and react to even-so changes in carbon dioxide levels. They're the body's timekeepers, keeping gases balanced without conscious effort. Fentanyl's danger comes from how it seizes this system. The same receptors that regulate pain and reward also sit in these control centers. Normally, when endorphins briefly activate them, the signal takes the edge off stress or discomfort while leaving the rhythm of breathing intact. The fentanyl floods the receptors and holds them open, shutting down neuronal firing that drives diaphragm and chest contraction. Instead of relaxing the body, the signal ends up silencing the impulse to draw air. Breathing, which should continue in the background without pause, suddenly halts. Other opioids can produce respiratory depression too, but their timeline looks different. With heroin, breathing slows gradually, often over 30 minutes or more. A person slumps, becomes sluggish, their chest rising shallowly as oxygen levels drift downward. This slow decline offers some possibility for recognition and reversal. Fentanyl compresses that entire curve into a span of seconds. Because it passes into the brain so efficiently and binds receptors so firmly, the collapse can happen almost instantly. The effect is less a slope and more a sharp drop, like a switch flicking off. Researchers tracking oxygen levels in the brain confirm the speed. Electrochemical studies in animals show fentanyl causes a dose-dependent plunge in brain oxygen, with levels reaching their lowest point in just 1 to 2 minutes. That freefall comes directly from suppressed breathing and reduced oxygen in the blood. Instead of a gradual suffocation, the process is explosive in speed, depriving neurons of oxygen before anyone around has time to understand what's happening. The system normally makes constant adjustments to maintain balance, but fentanyl strips those levers away. Carbon dioxide builds, sensors remain silent, and the neurons that should trigger stronger breaths sit muted. Within minutes, oxygen supply to the brain falls sharply. Nerve cells, highly sensitive to deprivation, begin to fail. First comes confusion, then unconsciousness, and then irreversible damage as tissues starve. This is respiratory depression in practice, not a gentle drift, but a sudden severing of the brain's connection to the lungs. Comparisons at overdose scenes underscore the difference. A person overdosing on heroin may show shallow, rattling breaths or bluish lips long before arrest, warning signs that allow intervention. With fentanyl, the margin collapses. 3 or 4 minutes might be all that separates an apparently normal state from respiratory arrest. By the time unresponsiveness is noticed, the brain may already have been starved of oxygen too long for naloxone alone to restore full function. That speed also explains why multiple people in a group may die simultaneously after using fentanyl. Heroin leaves staggered warning moments. Fentanyl does not. Whole groups can lose consciousness before anyone has the chance to reach for help. In clinical terms, fentanyl has stripped away the buffer that heroin once left. Seconds really are the margin, and fentanyl consumes those seconds before action can be taken. The mechanics follow the same lock-and-key model seen in the reward circuits. In the medulla, receptors normally quiet breathing just enough during rest or stress relief. Fentanyl presses those receptors to maximum silence, shutting down the very circuits that drive the chest to rise. Imagine microphones tuned to detect whispers overwhelmed with blaring static. The signal disappears and the response system collapses. The person loses not only conscious control, but also the autopilot that keeps breathing moving during sleep or distraction. From outside, the tragedy looks deceptively calm. Unlike drowning, which shows violent struggle, fentanyl overdose usually produces stillness. Someone may recline or sleep, appearing peaceful, but internally, oxygen saturation is plummeting, carbon dioxide is climbing, and the brain is seconds from catastrophic failure. Friends or family nearby often mistake the stillness for rest instead of crisis. Public health guidance stresses that if a person is unresponsive and their breathing is noisy, shallow, or absent, it must be treated as an opioid emergency immediately, no matter how calm it looks. Even the description passing out misleads. Alcohol intoxication allows unconsciousness while breathing continues. Heroin overdoses often leave slow, shallow breathing that can be interrupted. Fentanyl removes those stages. Consciousness doesn't. Damn, it cuts out, and it drags respiration down with it. The switch metaphor captures it. A crash, not a fade. This rapid collapse challenges responders as well. Arriving to the scene, they may find relaxed muscles have obstructed airways, chest movement absent, and a body limp. Beyond administering naloxone, they often have to clear airways and use ventilation to force oxygen back into the lungs. Each minute that passes translates into hypoxia, which means lasting injuries even for survivors. Memory loss, cognitive decline, and organ damage are common outcomes, even when a person is technically revived. Naloxone can save lives, but its timing under fentanyl exposure is crucial. Because the hypoxic window is so short, naloxone must be given as early as possible. Studies emphasize that delayed administration, after the critical brain oxygen nadir, may restore breathing without reversing the brain injury that already occurred. This is why public health campaigns push for naloxone distribution widely, from universities to nightclubs. Its life-saving potential depends less on skill than on speed. Friends with a dose in hand at the moment of collapse can make the difference. A late ambulance, arriving 5 minutes too late, may not restore what was lost. From the perspective of users, the trap often doesn't appear until it's already sprung. People assume overdose comes from an obviously large amount. With fentanyl, even dust-sized errors in measurement push doses into lethal territory. Because these amounts are barely visible, there's no intuitive sense of danger. A pill that looks safe, a line indistinguishable from cocaine powder, can hold enough fentanyl to stop breathing before there's time to react. The physical scale of the dose, fractions of a milligram, feels impossible to reconcile with its consequences. The evolutionary irony is stark. Automatic breathing is one of biology's most efficient, time-tested systems. Yet fentanyl, engineered only decades ago, defeats it almost instantly. People sometimes describe fentanyl as hitting harder. That phrase misses the actual danger. It doesn't just hit harder, it removes breathing safety margins entirely. It rewrites survival reflex into vulnerability, changing unconscious security into a fragile variable. And this is the respiratory trap. More than euphoria, more than addiction cycles, it is the silencing of the body's most basic command. The shift from air to silence happens so quickly that witnesses rarely understand what is taking place until the outcome is irreversible. Even survivors often carry the cost in permanent impairments. For families seeing it from the outside, the quietness makes the shock feel incomprehensible. But one question remains. If fentanyl is capable of such devastation, if it collapses breathing so fast, and if its highs often cut short and unpleasant, why has it become the dominant opioid on the street? That paradox doesn't come from the user's side of the equation. It comes from what fentanyl represents to the people who supply it. The dealer's perfect product. Here's the reality. Fentanyl didn't come to dominate because users love it. In fact, many describe the high as thin, short-lived, and filled with unease. The real force behind its rise is not demand from users, but the way it functions in the economy of drug supply. For the people who move product, Fentanyl offers advantages no crop-based drug ever could. From the supplier's perspective, it is less about pleasure and more about logistics, profit margins, production costs, and ease of concealment. In those categories, fentanyl is the perfect entry on the ledger. Look at the contrast with heroin. Heroin depends on land and crops. Acres of poppy fields, farmers to tend them, workers to harvest, and entire supply chains tied to changing weather and political instability. When a harvest is bad, when eradication campaigns spray fields, or when borders tighten, heroin supply dips. Entire price structures rise and fall depending on the soil. By comparison, fentanyl breaks from that model completely. It isn't grown, it's manufactured. No climate, no planting season, no irrigation. Everything begins and ends in a lab with chemical precursors. If a farmer loses a crop, production halts. If a synthetic lab loses a shipment of precursors, producers simply order another batch. The convenience removes one of the biggest risks in illicit narcotics, how unpredictable natural crops can be. That lab-based reduction changes every layer of the supply chain. With heroin or cocaine, traffickers need sizable shipments. Crates, pallets, or multi-ton loads must be hidden in trucks and containers, leaving behind huge logistical trails. Fentanyl flips that balance because it is active in microgram doses. That means that a kilogram, a few pounds of material, can be turned into hundreds of thousands or even millions of street units. The density alone reshapes the trafficking model. Instead of moving tons of plant-based material, cartels can compress the same profit into something that fits in a suitcase. Security forces used to scanning ports for entire truckloads of bulky plant derivatives now face the challenge of spotting packages that can look no different than ordinary powders or lab reagents. And according to federal seizure data, this is not just theory. In 2023, more than 115 million fentanyl-containing counterfeit pills were confiscated in the United States alone, evidence of the massive volume produced from comparatively tiny shipments. This efficiency changes the economics overnight. A heroin smuggler must account for the weight of the cargo, the size of the shipment, and the escalating risk at every checkpoint. With fentanyl, a single courier can fly with enough material in a backpack to supply an entire metropolitan area. Even if a load is seized, the financial loss is minimal compared to the blow of losing multi-ton cocaine or heroin shipments. The economics lean sharply in favor of fentanyl because the cost-to-profit ratio is unmatched. The background research consistently shows what traffickers already know: compact potency, cheap precursors, and lab scalability make fentanyl extraordinarily profitable. Inside street-level distribution, these same traits give sellers more advantages. Traditional heroin operations needed larger packages broken down into smaller parcels before hitting the street. That process created more opportunities for seizure and made storage conspicuous. Fentanyl overturns that too. Dealers need only grams of powder to cover local markets. Hiding a supply no longer requires warehouses. It can be disguised in everyday household containers. Police raids that uncover only a handful of grams are still uncovering caches that could supply thousands of doses. That ratio distorts enforcement efforts because what looks minor on the table can fuel major harm in the community. There's another factor. Fentanyl as a cutting agent. Because such tiny quantities are required, it can be blended into counterfeit pills or mixed into cocaine to increase both appeal and dependence. The resulting product may sell in the name of another drug, but the fentanyl component creates rapid tolerance and faster repeat usage. For dealers, this transforms the business model. Cocaine once built its reputation on energizing highs. Counterfeit Xanax tried to resemble calming benzodiazepines. Now, by adding fentanyl, each product carries an embedded mechanism for increasing dependency. It ensures that customers come back sooner, even if the high itself is shorter and rougher. That cycle suits traffickers because it maximizes turnover and stretches raw material, multiplying profits. This introduces a clear divide between demand and supply. People who buy pills or powders rarely ask for fentanyl directly. Surveys and anecdotal reports show users often prefer heroin, meth, or benzodiazepines when given the choice. Fentanyl does not carry aspirational or cultural prestige. It isn't glamorized. But in an illicit market, the user's preference matters far less than the dealer's incentive. What moves is what suppliers push, and fentanyl yields higher returns with far lower exposure. For producers and distributors, it's not an ideological choice. It is pragmatic. Profit over user safety. That pragmatism explains why fentanyl has now consumed product categories it never should have touched. Xanax lookalikes, supposed Adderall tablets, small bags of cocaine, all turn up with fentanyl in them. Dealers benefit even if users don't know. Dependence develops without consent, and demand repeats whether or not the person intended to pursue opioids. The strategy relies on volume, not loyalty. If some customers die, the supply chain replaces them quickly through counterfeit pills or powders reaching new hands. In this structure, a customer's survival is statistically inconsequential. What matters is the constant turnover of sales. At a geopolitical scale, fentanyl further resists strategies once applied to cocaine or heroin interdiction. Eradication programs against coca fields or opium poppies relied on visibility. Satellite imagery, agricultural surveillance, crop destruction. Those tools work because the growth process was tied to geography. Fentanyl bypasses that entirely. Labs are diffuse, stationed in warehouses or residential basements, shifting as needed. Precursors can be sourced from multiple suppliers across global trade. Shut one port and another opens. The adaptability of this pipeline makes it far more elusive. Enforcement is forced to chase chemicals moving invisibly along normal shipping channels rather than identifying illegal hectares of farmland. The shift also rewrote pricing structure. Once fentanyl reached broad supply, heroin's value eroded. Many dealers no longer bothered with heroin at all. The overhead was too high and returns too limited. Fentanyl and its mixtures performed better for margins. Thus, users who wanted to avoid fentanyl often couldn't find alternatives. Heroin without fentanyl contamination became rare and expensive. The supply side moved deliberately, leaving individuals little choice in what actually reached them. Seen across the whole structure, fentanyl fits like a case study in market optimization. Production is scalable without geographic dependence. Costs are low relative to returns. Packaging and shipping are compact. Enforcement loses leverage because surveillance tools become ineffective. Distributors stretch doses and increase repetitions using mixtures that drive dependence. These are the reasons fentanyl persists, not because anyone admires the high, but because each stage of supply benefits from its properties. Forensic clarity matters here. Fentanyl's ascendancy says little about its qualities as an experience and everything about its qualities as an industrial commodity. To traffickers, it is efficient raw material. Its adoption is closer to a business decision than to the evolution of drug culture. For communities, the result is catastrophic, but for suppliers, it is what makes sense in the mathematics of risk and reward. The consequences at street level, though, are where the abstraction turns lethal. Because fentanyl can be placed invisibly inside counterfeit pills or blended into powders, people often consume it unknowingly. That means the logic of supply and profit directly translates into risk far beyond opioid users themselves. Someone expecting a stimulant or a mild sedative becomes exposed to a compound that shuts down breathing within minutes. The risk is no longer about whether someone seeks it. It's about whether they realize they are exposed at all. Contaminated roulette. Street drugs now carry a hidden risk that overshadows everything else, fentanyl contamination. This isn't about people deliberately choosing opioids. Lines of cocaine, counterfeit Xanax, Molly at a festival, even pills sold as ADHD medication can all be tainted. The tablet that looks like a calming bar can contain nothing but a dangerously efficient opioid dose. Fentanyl doesn't change color, doesn't give away its presence through taste, and isn't recognizable by casual inspection. Each time someone swallows or snorts what they think is routine, they're stepping into a gamble driven by supply economics and chemical potency. The contamination is not random. It's deliberate strategy. Mixing fentanyl into other drugs cuts costs, stretches supply, and causes dependence faster. A counterfeit Xanax pressed with fentanyl costs pennies to make but sells for the same price as a pharmaceutical brand tablet. Cocaine blended with fentanyl keeps customers from walking away by creating instant tolerance and withdrawal. Dealers don't add it to improve the drug. They add it because it multiplies profit. Unlike heroin and meth, which require substantial weight to stock neighborhoods, fentanyl's dosage scale is microscopic. A few careless specks can swing a pill from harmless placebo to lethal catastrophe. No user can see the difference until breathing slows or stops. This reach has reshaped entire social spaces. Party drugs, once framed as relatively safe, cocaine at a house party, ecstasy in nightlife, Xanax to wind down, have folded into an overdose landscape indistinguishable from heroin use. Festivals that worried about dehydration are now littered with cases of poison pills. College towns that once viewed cocaine as a social lubricant record fatal overdoses from first-time students who never thought of themselves as opioid users. The separation between stimulant culture and opioid culture has vanished. The real market is one unified system, fentanyl present in places people never intended to encounter opioids at all. From the perspective of the people using it, feels absurdly mismatched. An anxious student believes one pill will calm them. A worker accepts one bump of cocaine to loosen up at a party. A group of friends splits tablets, so does ecstasy. None of them picture themselves as candidates for opioid overdose. Yet fentanyl infiltrates all these pathways at once. The contradiction is simple. Intentions are small, but the results can be fatal. The randomness is what deepens the danger. One counterfeit pill may contain trace amounts below perceptible affect, while another from the same batch could carry doses high enough to kill. The process of mixing isn't careful chemistry. It's crude stirring in uncontrolled environments. Equal distribution doesn't exist. The unpredictability explains why cases emerge where one participant dies while others who use the same product remain unaffected. To the person on the outside, that inconsistency looks incomprehensible. Inside the system, it's just the nature of contamination. An analogy makes the point plain. Imagine a jar of candy, outwardly uniform, but with an unknown portion poisoned. You can't tell which half is lethal. Every handful looks identical and smells identical. That's essentially the choice people face with street pills or powders. Drug use once meant risking dependence. In 2025, it often means gambling on whether that single trial will collapse your breathing before any habit even forms. The shift is not toward risk spread over time, but risk concentrated in a very first exposure. The anxiety around this has driven harm. Reduction measures, though unevenly. Fentanyl test strips circulate at concerts and colleges, showing people how to dissolve small samples in water and check for contamination. Bars and music festivals increasingly hold Naloxone kits on hand in case of emergencies. These defenses exist because contamination isn't rare. It's expected. However, they depend on awareness, and casual users often don't think they need tools associated with hard drug use. A young person taking what they believe is a calming prescription pill probably doesn't think to test it or carry naloxone. Yet that very pill may be more likely to contain fentanyl than heroin ever was. Evidence from multiple countries confirms how complete the takeover has become. Canadian surveillance reported that about 3/4 of opioid toxicity deaths in 2024 involve fentanyl. Those figures underline that fentanyl isn't just reshaping U.S. markets, it's dominating wherever illicit supply chains reach. Reports across North America show the pattern repeating. Stimulant users comprise a growing share of fentanyl fatalities. It's about fentanyl bleeding across boundaries and erasing categories people once trusted to separate risky from mild. The collapse of categories also distorts public perception. The idea of hard versus soft drugs was already an imperfect shorthand. Once fentanyl became a default additive, those cultural distinctions stopped mattering. Cocaine might seem less frightening than heroin, or taking a tablet marketed as anxiety relief might feel less daunting than seeking out opioids deliberately. In practice, both may contain the same opioid. The illusion of choice becomes a trap, because fentanyl doesn't signal its presence in ways users can detect. What this means statistically is striking. Public health investigators report rising numbers of unintentional opioid poisonings among individuals with no prior opioid history. Among them are young professionals and students whose drug patterns lean towards stimulants, not depressants. Numbers aren't necessarily precise, but the trend is clear. People are dying not after years of use, but at the point of first or second exposure because fentanyl shortcuts survival windows that older drugs left. Its speed is uniquely cruel. Because fentanyl acts rapidly on brainstem breathing centers, those who unknowingly consume it may never realize they are in danger. A stimulant user who starts flagging during a binge might misinterpret opioid sedation for simple exhaustion, while in reality their oxygen levels are collapsing. A counterfeit Xanax may appear to calm stress, only to cause unconsciousness before the user has any chance to recognize overdose signs. The silence of this onset makes it particularly difficult to intervene. The clues are subtle until the crisis is at its worst. The reach goes further still. Reports even document marijuana products, including edibles, tainted by fentanyl. Part of the appeal of cannabis has long been its low overdose risk. But cross-contamination blurs even that category, placing inexperienced users into direct danger without warning. This erosion of trust spreads socially because it suggests that any unregulated product can be suspect. Reliability ceases to exist. The background assumption now is roulette, with survival hanging on chance and supplier practice. The obvious question is why contamination continues, even while users die at such high rates. The answer stays brutally pragmatic. It works for those profiting from it. Cheap precursors make fentanyl easy to produce in bulk. Minimal inputs stretch across vast numbers of counterfeit tablets or diluted powders. Dependence builds faster, increasing transaction frequency. Even deaths don't deter the system because new customers cycle in. The economics value turnover, not survival. Satisfaction or user preference doesn't matter. Continuity of purchase is enough. That logic undermines traditional prevention narratives. Parents used to tell children to avoid hard opioids like heroin. That rule feels obsolete because fentanyl infiltrates options far outside heroin use. A young person can avoid opioids explicitly and still be exposed to a counterfeit prescription or a line of cocaine shared at a party. Abstaining from one drug group is no longer protective. Categories no longer map onto actual risks. In today's climate, the word opioid doesn't describe intent. It describes what you may get regardless of intent. Even people who try to stay cautious face constant risk. Test strips detect fentanyl in many samples, but they don't catch every analog and mixtures are inconsistent. Results can be misleading when active drug isn't evenly distributed. Carrying Naloxone provides one safety net, but someone needs to notice the collapse quickly in order to administer it. The best approach, experts emphasize, combines tools, rapid testing where possible, plus naloxone kept nearby. This doesn't eliminate risk, but it does increase chances of survival. Without awareness, though, those advantages disappear. The simple and brutal truth of the contaminated market is that many people never even get far enough to grapple with addiction. The greatest threat isn't long-term dependence, but the possibility that the very first encounter is fatal. Choices that once seemed casual now resemble coin flips against death. And yet, for the smaller share who do survive repeated exposure, another pattern emerges. Fentanyl may not kill them immediately, but it begins reshaping the body and brain in harsher ways than its predecessors. Instead of the long, steady high heroin once provided, fentanyl delivers weak, short-lived relief and a rapid, punishing crash. This is what makes its pull so destructive. Not pleasure, but the cycle of withdrawal it leaves behind. Addiction beyond the high. Fentanyl use doesn't just create moments of risk, it forges a relentless cycle that feeds on itself. Addiction in this case is not about pursuit of joy, but about the way the brain and body adapt under assault. The phenomenon is often described as addiction beyond the high, because what pulls people deeper into dependence is not euphoria, but the conditions left in its absence. From the start, fentanyl's effects are described by users as unusually flat. The high arrives quickly and vanishes almost immediately, leaving behind discomfort instead of calm. In the gap left after that peak, the body begins sending alarm signals that something is missing, flipping into withdrawal far faster than with other opioids. What follows is not relief but an abrupt surge of distress. Pain feels sharper, restlessness builds, and instead of drifting to hours of intoxication, people are met with agitation within minutes. This short-lived effect means the drug is not sustaining euphoria, but triggering a rebound that drives another hit. Tolerance builds on top of this. Clinical and pharmacologic studies indicate that tolerance to the pleasurable effects of fentanyl can develop quickly, often faster than tolerance to respiratory suppression. That imbalance creates one of fentanyl's most dangerous paradoxes. Users need higher doses to feel any subjective effect, even while their breathing remains highly vulnerable to shut down. The result is that each step up in dosage increases overdose risk rather than improving safety. The body adapts unevenly, leaving people in a narrowing gap between no relief and sudden collapse. For someone attempting to quit, withdrawal becomes a defining feature of dependence. The discomfort is not mild craving or restlessness, it is total body rebellion. Pain sensitivity spikes so high that everyday pressure and movement feel unbearable. The gastrointestinal system enters chaos, alternating between nausea, cramps, and diarrhea with no stability in between. Anxiety presses harder with every passing hour, while muscles twitch uncontrollably and energy collapses. The nervous system, deprived of the opioid control signals it adjusted to rely upon, floods with unfiltered discomfort. Many relapse not in search of pleasure, but because the misery of withdrawal is so persistent that it leaves escape as the only realistic option. Sleep disruption makes this cycle even more destructive. Insomnia during fentanyl withdrawal is intense, legs and arms jerk uncontrollably, thought spirals run unchecked, and the body never settles. Exhaustion layers on the physical distress, while hallucinations, paranoia, or night sweats fill each attempt at rest. The absence of restorative sleep compounds despair, and for many this is the breaking point that drives them back toward use, not for euphoria but for a chance at sleep. The psychology of dependence shifts as well. While heroin has an association with sedative escape or dreamlike calm, fentanyl doesn't offer that illusion. Its use becomes less about pursuit and more about avoidance. The dominant memory isn't a pleasure. It's of the punishment the body inflicts when the drug is withheld. People begin structuring their behavior not to chase good memories, but to avoid the return of panic, pain, and sleeplessness. Motivation itself rewires around the avoidance of harm rather than the pull of reward. Compared with heroin, the difference is stark. Heroin can extend intoxication over several hours, creating windows where users can manage routines between doses. Fentanyl leaves almost no space. Instead of 1 or 2 periods of use across a day, fentanyl dependence pulls people into dosing a dozen or more times in order to keep withdrawal at bay. Every sober interval triggers acute distress, forcing redosing not as a path to enjoyment, but as a requirement to function at all. The fallout from this cycle dismantles daily life more quickly than other opioids. Employment becomes difficult when hours are fractured by physical collapse. Relationships dissolve under the strain of constant crisis and repeated relapse. Families report sharper acceleration into homelessness, visible decline, and fatal overdose when fentanyl replaces heroin. What once spiraled over years with other opioids can be compressed into months. The pace increases because the drug doesn't offer manageable space between crises. It ties withdrawal and relief so tightly that people struggle just to stabilize from one day to the next. At the neurochemical level, the mechanisms are well documented. Endorphins normally modulate pain by activating receptors in small, balanced bursts, but fentanyl swamps them. When the drug clears, the system overshoots in the other direction. Neurons fire uncontrolled pain signals, receptors fail to moderate stress hormones, and circuits responsible for sleep and balance remain hyperactive. This rebound explains why muscles ache as if injured, the gut shreds. Itself in spasms, and the mind cascades into paranoia. The body, lacking its normal calibrated control, turns punishing. The blunting of reward from ordinary life compounds the torment. Food loses its appeal, laughter feels hollow, music offers no lift. This isn't only a state of mind, it reflects receptor systems that no longer respond well to normal stimuli because they've been forced to adapt to extreme fentanyl surges. When daily pleasures stop producing joy and when withdrawal produces acute suffering, the drug becomes the only lever still capable of altering experience, not because it creates happiness, but because it keeps pain momentarily at a duller level. This shift is amplified by relapse. When someone takes fentanyl again, the result is fleeting stabilization rather than lasting relief. Within minutes or hours, the cycle resets. Each repetition pushes tolerance higher, raising the dose needed to silence withdrawal symptoms. But with such a narrow therapeutic index, the dose that quiets discomfort may already sit dangerously close to one that stops breathing. This creates an impossible gamble. Every survival tactic brings them nearer to overdose. The addiction stabilizes nothing. It forces a choice between agony and suffocation. When seen from the outside, this behavior can seem irrational. But inside the body of someone dependent, the dynamic feels automatic. The demands of withdrawal override reasoning by sheer intensity. Judgment becomes irrelevant compared to the need to stop pain, nausea, and panic. In such conditions, lectures about self-control are functionally meaningless. The biology is louder than external persuasion. That fact explains why treatment rarely succeeds when based only on personal resolve. The ordeal of withdrawal dismantles willpower because it overwhelms core physical function. Cold withdrawal can carry days of ceaseless pain, insomnia, digestive collapse, and nervous system agitation intense enough to break even strong motivation. This is why evidence-based care emphasizes support beyond endurance. Medication-assisted therapies like Methadone, Buprenorphine, and Naloxone act on the same receptors to restore stability. Research shows these medications can normalize disrupted signaling, soften withdrawal, and reduce cravings by taming the neurobiological damage that fentanyl leaves behind. They are not substitutes for motivation, but scaffolding that restores enough balance for meaningful recovery to even begin. For treatment providers, fentanyl has meant waves of patients arriving at levels of distress greater than other opioids produced. Facilities report more acute symptoms, more frequent relapse attempts, and higher risk of fatal overdose during withdrawal. Where heroin allows slightly slower cycles, fentanyl creates urgent, severe spirals that push relapse unless medical management steps in. The high fades fast, the withdrawal hits harder, and the body learns dependence on a timeline far shorter than older opioids introduced. The result is a form of dependence stripped almost entirely of pursuit of pleasure. It is not about seeking reward so much as surviving punishment. The reward circuitry is dulled, the pain circuitry is amplified, and dependence becomes a survival tactic carried out against the user's own interests. From the outside, this dynamic looks like reckless choice. From the inside, it feels like staying alive for another hour. Even when fentanyl doesn't end life instantly, the adaptation it carves into the brain and body leaves a deeper question. What happens to those who survive years of use, cycling between fleeting relief and crushing withdrawal? If the short-term mechanics tear routines apart, the longer-lasting consequences push even further. Addiction beyond the high is only one layer. Beyond the cycle of use and withdrawal, people carry residual changes that continue shaping their health long after a single dose leaves the system. The silent, long-term damage. Most people picture fentanyl as an instant killer, the inhaled powder, the hidden pill, the sudden stop of breath. But survival does not mean safety. For those who escape the moment, fentanyl leaves impacts that unfold over months and years, changing how the brain, organs, and mood function long after use ends. These aren't obvious tragedies caught on camera, but quieter injuries that turn survival into a lifetime of strain. The sharpest injuries center in the brain. Opioid receptors sit not only in pain and pleasure pathways, but also across networks that govern motivation, focus, and memory. Under repeated saturation by fentanyl, these circuits weaken. What once sparked joy, laughter, music, shared meals comes through muted or flat. The dopamine surges linked to everyday rewards diminish as receptor density drops and baseline neurotransmitter levels shift downward. People describe themselves as unable to feel pleasure even when surrounded by family or achievements. Anhedonia, and it is one of the biggest drivers of relapse. When normal life feels empty, fentanyl seems like the only key left that still works. This flattening of motivation complicates recovery. Survivors who attempt sobriety often report not only low mood, but reduced ability to focus or plan. The parts of the brain responsible for executive function, the frontal cortex in particular, are highly sensitive to overstimulation from opioids. Chronic fentanyl exposure alters signaling in these regions, making tasks like organizing steps, prioritizing goals, or recalling details feel unusually difficult. Studies of long-term opioid use show impaired cognitive flexibility and weakened memory that persist even after abstinence. Some recovery is possible with time and rehabilitation, but certain deficits, especially after repeated overdoses that deprive the brain of oxygen, can remain for life. Recent preclinical research adds another layer. In 2024, a study published in Brain Research Bulletin found that animals exposed to chronic fentanyl developed oxidative stress, neuroinflammation, programmed cell death, and white matter injury in the cortex. The findings highlight physical injury at the cellular level, damage not visible in day-to-day life but severe enough to change how brain tissue functions and communicates. Researchers caution that long-term human outcomes are still being studied, but the patterns of depression, memory decline, and mood instability seen in clinics align uncomfortably well with these mechanistic results. The brain is not alone in carrying scars. Repeated fentanyl use strains the cardiovascular system, often in subtle increments. Every near overdose deprives the heart of oxygen, weakening its muscle tissue over time. Survivors of recurring episodes show higher risks of arrhythmias, hypertension, and diminished cardiac efficiency even years later. For younger people especially, new fragility in the heart shortens the horizon of health, leaving them vulnerable to sudden events that bodies their age would not normally face. While cardiac rehabilitation and medication can stabilize function, the tissue lost to oxygen deprivation does not regenerate. Each collapse is not only a passing scare, but a cut into an organ that must already carry the burden of survival. Equally corrosive is the impact on hormonal balance. Opioids suppress endocrine function, lowering production of testosterone, estrogen, and growth hormones. Extended fentanyl use drives levels far below normal ranges, producing fatigue, fertility challenges, loss of libido, mood swings, and early bone density loss. Young users endure disruptions to puberty and development, while adults experience premature aging and osteoporosis. Some balance can return after recovery, but endocrine shifts often linger for years, requiring consistent medical monitoring and sometimes lifelong supplementation. The immune system weakens under fentanyl as well. Opioids suppress white blood cell activity, blunting the body's natural defense. In practice, this means illnesses that would amount to common inconveniences become recurring or severe. Pneumonia, wound infections, and skin diseases appear repeatedly. People in recovery may face stretch after stretch of illness not because of reckless behavior, but because their immune system was reconditioned into frailty. While some immune resilience can rebound, compromised healing and higher risk of infection remain part of many survivors' long-term health struggles. Every organ system feels the strain. The gastrointestinal tract remains unstable after prolonged opioid use, with constipation, abdominal pain, and disrupted motility lingering well beyond detox. The liver and kidneys, which filter toxins, often show gradual scarring from processing inconsistent illicit mixtures. Over years, this can turn into cirrhosis, renal stress, or outright failure. Dental and skeletal decline adds further load. Fentanyl dries out the mouth, feeds gum disease, accelerates tooth loss, and, combined with weakened bone density, produces fractures at ages when bone should be at its most secure. Layered across this physical damage is the quieter harm of repeated oxygen deprivation from overdoses that did not kill. Neurons starved of oxygen die in clusters, leaving survivors with motor disruptions, memory haze, or speech troubles. Neurologists sometimes compare the presentation to stroke survivors. Every close call, therefore, means more than a near-death moment. It leaves behind invisible knots of permanent neural loss. Compounding these physical and cognitive scars, the psychological landscape changes drastically. Depression becomes entrenched not as a fleeting mood, but as a function of rewired circuits. Anxiety often joins it, driven by unstable hormone levels and lateral brain changes. Nightmares are common, and panic attacks emerge with little provocation.
Survivors often feel as though symptoms chase them even in sobriety.
Feeds the dangerous temptation to use again for short-term relief. In this sense, fentanyl pulls people not only into dependence while they are using, but also leaves vulnerabilities that threaten recovery for years afterward. None of this damage exists in a vacuum. Relationships fracture when survivors find social contact unrewarding or exhausting. Employment falters under the pressure of fatigue, memory lapses, and illness. A body still alive after fentanyl rarely returns to its earlier baseline. Even with dedication to treatment, survivors build their lives on new limits, carrying endurance tests through each day that others do not see. It's important to stress that not all outcomes are absolute. Some cognitive function can strengthen again with abstinence, therapy, and medication. Hormone levels may partially normalize, immune resilience may improve, and neuroplasticity offers the brain some capacity to rebuild. But even with recovery pathways, certain injuries like neurons lost during hypoxia or scarred tissue in the heart remain irreparable. Survivors live with a mixture of regained capacity and lingering damage, constantly navigating between recovery potential and permanent loss. The weight of these hidden harms shapes not only health but perception. For families, survival after fentanyl overdose can create false reassurance. They see revived breathing but not weakened cardiovascular tissue, the ongoing erosion of cognition, or the hormonal imbalances producing despair. Survivors, too, are often misled into blaming personal weakness for fatigue or depression, when the deeper truth is that fentanyl itself carved biological scars they must now carry. This is fentanyl's quieter brutality. Beyond the obvious overdose lies a continuum of harm that advances through the years. Strained organs, dulled pleasure, stolen resilience. Escaping death once does not end the assault. The drug continues to echo through the body long after the chemical itself is gone. And yet the chemical named fentanyl is only one part of the story. What many forget is that it exists as a single compound among dozens of laboratory variations. The next threat doesn't always look like fentanyl at all. It looks like its cousins, altered analogs designed to slip through cracks in regulation and push the limits of human tolerance even further. The shape-shifting analogs. When fentanyl dominates the headlines, it often seems like the story stops there, a singular chemical looming over the drug market. But the truth is more unsettling. Fentanyl is not a lone compound, but part of a broad and shifting family of synthetic opioids known as analogs. These are laboratory-made relatives, each altered slightly at the molecular level. Public health workers emphasize that what people encounter on the street is often not fentanyl itself, but one of these modified versions, adjusted just enough to evade legal controls and detection systems. Among the most notorious is carfentanil. If fentanyl is already deadly in microgram quantities, carfentanil multiplies the danger dramatically. Originally developed to tranquilize massive animals such as elephants, it is estimated to be hundreds of times more potent than morphine and about 100 times stronger than fentanyl. That means that a few visible grains of this substance could represent dozens of lethal doses for humans. Carfentanil has been discovered in street supplies across North America, where it's been linked to overdose waves that overwhelm emergency medical responses. First responders often find that a single dose of Naloxone, normally effective for opioid overdoses, is insufficient. Carfentanil's tight binding at receptors and sheer potency force responders to administer multiple repeated doses before a patient's breathing resumes. Yet the landscape of analogs extends well beyond carfentanil. One group under increasing scrutiny is the Nitazenes. These compounds emerged more recently but are already being detected in multiple markets. Some nitazene analogs have been shown in research to surpass fentanyl's potency, making them arguably even more dangerous. Their distribution reflects the same pattern of substitution, labs quickly pivoting to whichever analog offers high profit with relatively low legal risk. Many people who consume street drugs never realize they're exposed to nitazenes at all. They assume they're taking fentanyl, or cocaine, or a counterfeit pill, without realizing they've ingested a synthetic opioid even more powerful than fentanyl itself. The mechanism behind these analogs is remarkably simple. By changing a small structural component of fentanyl's molecule, altering an atom group here or a side chain there, chemists create a new substance. To the brain's receptors, these changes make little difference. But for regulatory systems, the differences matter enormously. Drug laws often list specific molecules, and until regulators identify, evaluate, and explicitly schedule the new analog, suppliers exploit the lag as a legal gray zone. This is why the appearance of analogs rarely slows. As soon as one is scheduled for control, chemists tweak it and produce the next. From a health standpoint, every analog carries unique variables. Some dissolve in the brain tissue at different rates, making their onset unpredictable. Others remain in circulation longer, prolonging withdrawal or dimming the effectiveness of naloxone. Still others cause unexpected side effects. Seizures, abnormal heart rhythms, spikes in body temperature that traditional opioids do not typically trigger. These differences create confusion for both users and emergency responders. A paramedic expecting standard signs of respiratory depression may instead face collapsed breathing combined with erratic heartbeat, or victims who appear stabilized only to relapse hours later when a long-lasting analog outpaces the naloxone administered. It is this unpredictability rather than potency alone that transforms each analog into new terrain of risk. The market benefits traffickers more than anyone else. By swapping atoms to churn out fresh compounds, labs keep supply flowing under minimal threat of legal disruption. If precursor chemicals for one analog run short, traffickers transition to another with near seamless substitution. The adaptability of synthetic chemistry means they do not rely on crops or complicated harvests, only raw materials ordered in bulk. Unlike heroin or cocaine, which require cultivation and smuggling of large volumes, analogs can be manufactured by the kilo and pressed into millions of counterfeit tablets with deadly efficiency. The volatility in which analog appears on the street doesn't matter to the sellers because addiction creates stable demand. It matters only to the people consuming the product, whose risks change with every batch. Harm reduction tools are strained in this environment. Fentanyl test strips designed to catch certain analog structures do not have equal sensitivity across all classes. Research shows their detection range varies, causing strip blind spots when a less common analog is present. That means a user can test a powder or pill, see no positive response, and mistakenly believe it is free of opioids. In reality, the substance may contain a fentanyl cousin that evades detection. This undermines confidence in harm reduction, even though the strips still offer protection against many, but not all forms. Public health experts advise that people treat strips as one layer of defense and pair them with other strategies such as carrying naloxone, using with trusted groups, and avoiding consumption entirely in unfamiliar settings. The advice is simple but crucial. Testing improves your odds, but it is not absolute protection in a supply chain built on chemical mutability. Naloxone itself, while still a cornerstone of overdose response, faces limits as analogs diversify. Its action hinges on displacing opioids from their receptors, but analogs that bind more aggressively may resist displacement, requiring higher or repeated naloxone dosing. Emergency departments report cases of victims revived initially only to relapse later because long-lasting analogs outlast the naloxone's effect. This forces responders to monitor patients for significant periods after apparent recovery and fuels debate about whether higher initial naloxone doses should become standard in the age of fentanyl and nitazenes. Communities accustomed to the idea of a single naloxone spray bringing someone back need to know that analogs often push beyond that expectation. Survival can demand multiple interventions and sustain medical monitoring. The analog arms race destabilizes every attempt at stabilization. Warnings that carfentanil is circulating 1 month may be followed by nitazenes the next. Prevention campaigns struggle to stay relevant when the drug itself mutates faster than messaging can keep pace. Communities fatigued by constant alerts sometimes grow desensitized, ignoring warnings just as risks intensify. Public health alerts shift from town to town, describing overdoses that look different from the last, while the underlying reason is simply chemical substitution. From the ground, this evolves into a perception of randomness or chaos, when in fact the patterns track directly to chemistry's ability to modify opioids in minor but consequential ways. This variability leaves people facing impossible odds. Even those who avoid opioids intentionally are at risk, because analogs bleed into counterfeit medications and stimulant supplies. A person who believes they are consuming familiar cocaine faces the possibility of snorting a potent analog instead. A student who trusts a counterfeit benzodiazepine for anxiety. Relief may inadvertently trigger respiratory collapse in minutes. The unpredictability erases any sense of control. Each pill, each line, is as much about chemistry's current mutation as it is about personal choice. Some might wonder if the problem can ever be curbed through enforcement, but legal pathways bend faster than they can be reinforced. Laboratories only need minor substitutions to skirt around new schedules, and by the time authorities catch up, street supplies have already shifted. International collaboration to restrict precursor flow faces the same challenge. Blocked access to one chemical often sparks the creation of a new analog using a different precursor. This resilience ensures that the crisis never stabilizes around one substance. Instead, users face an evolving swarm of molecules, each designed to face forward past current restrictions, each one rewriting the risk profile yet again. For families and survivors, this chemical fluidity explains why experiences of overdose look less consistent than they once did. Why one pill takes hours to kill while another drops someone in seconds. Why naloxone sometimes revives quickly, while in other cases a cluster of sprays barely buys time. The difference isn't random cruelty, but the shifting mixture of analogs coursing through the illicit supply. They create not only physical damage, but also cultural confusion, disrupting the old narrative of what opioid use looked like. Opioid overdose is no longer a single pattern. It is a rotating set of biochemical experiments carried out on human lives. Carfentanil and nitazenes illustrate just 2 points on the spectrum, but reviews show dozens already mapped, and dozens more possible given the ease of chemistry. With each new analog, the margin for error shrinks further. Harm reduction can still save lives. Test strips, naloxone access, supervised environments, but each works best when paired with acknowledgement that these are provisional defenses against an evolving threat. Overconfidence in any single tool is itself dangerous when the supply changes faster than detection methods evolve. A realistic view combines vigilance, preparation, and skepticism about what substances in the illicit market truly contain. What emerges from this picture is that the opioid crisis is not defined by stability. It is defined by change. Fentanyl was never an endpoint. It was a threshold into a chemically flexible crisis where the rules shift constantly. And within that shifting terrain lies an even darker truth. These compounds don't just create fleeting risk at the level of dosage or potency. They undermine the basic survival systems of the body, manipulating circuits designed by evolution to protect us and bending them toward destruction. That reality sets the stage for a deeper question. What happens when the systems built to guard life become the very pathways that end it? The future of survival. The future of survival in the fentanyl era rests less on individual willpower and more on immediate, practical defenses. Any pill or powder from an unregulated source should be assumed contaminated until proven otherwise. Carrying naloxone, or knowing where to get it fast, remains one of the most effective ways to interrupt collapse. And for those caught in cycles of dependence, evidence-based treatments like Methadone, Buprenorphine, and Naloxone are lifelines, helping the brain's receptors stabilize rather than collapse again. Public health responses echo these priorities: wider naloxone access, test strips, and the expansion of medication-based treatment. If you found this useful, leave a comment about what surprised you most and subscribe for more deep dives into hidden national crises.